Thank you. Thank you. All right. In 1961, Jung wrote, "A collective problem, if not recognized as such, always appears as a personal problem, and in individual cases may give the impression that something is out of order in the realm of the personal psyche. The personal sphere is indeed disturbed, but such disturbances need not be primary. They are secondary, the consequences of insupportable change in the social atmosphere." I believe that Jung's premise, psychological premise, anticipated the idea of cultural complexes, highlighting the importance for each of us to explore the psychological aspect of what we carry from the social cultural realms of our psyche. In both dreams and waking life, the line between self and society becomes blurred, raising important questions about our ability to engage life consciously. Drawing on various cultural, historical, and psychological influences, I aim to explore the subtle ways in which the social cultural environment and ancestral memory shaped my individual psychological tendencies. I invite you to join me in what's been an introspective journey where I became aware of the various cultural complexes in my psyche, and they helped me consider how they were influencing my attitudes and behaviors in the present culture that I'm a part of. Building on existential philosopher Soren Kierkegaard's belief that the simple truth of living is to feel oneself lost, 26 years ago, during my second year of analytic training at the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, I had a dream that has served as a self-reflective guide for navigating the complexities of intersecting cultural paths of power, authority, leadership, and responsibility that have shaped my psychological landscape. The images that you'll see here are sculptures that I created during the period when I was in training. In this dream, a giant fist crashed through the Institute's concrete outer wall while I was in a meeting with an evaluation committee. Alarmed, I waved to the analysts to turn around and see what was happening. But they ignored my warnings and said, just continue, we're continuing with business as usual. I felt confused and frightened by the futility of my communication. And I realized, oh dear, I'm alone with this vision. I left the room only to find that the Institute had become an insane asylum. Several others in the hallway offered to help me. First was a male analyst wearing dark glasses who asked me to follow him quietly. And the second came from a group of undocumented immigrants who wanted me to be their mule for their drugs. Both offers asked that I become involved in their deception, which I found unacceptable. Oh dear. In my state of disorientation, I found an empty office where I waited for consultation. Like many Jungians, I see our self-awareness and our identifications as only partly conscious, rooted in the developing ego complex, embedded in the larger psychic realm called the self. The realm includes both archetypal and collective experiences and visions, which shape and support religious and mythological traditions. From these cultural patterns, norms and values and rituals develop, giving meaning to the group's history and purpose. Some cultural memories, especially trauma-related, are mainly stored in unconsciously in the group psyche, influencing attitudes, actions, and rationales for future ideals. These unconscious, large group dynamics are what Tom Singer and Sam Kimble refer to as cultural complexes. Reflecting on my personal and collective experiences, I realized that hidden historical, national, and family motives had symbolically shaped my ego's perspective with intense emotions, both unsettling and profoundly meaningful. And they've connected me with the cultural complexes of the community that I'm in. I believe that we all must become aware and actually take responsibility for the existence and fluidity of these cultural complexes. These phantoms and stories, as Sam Kimbles describes them, exist in every individual, group, and culture, often unconsciously, and they act as a living legacy of social structures and past traumas, shaping perspectives unconsciously until their symbolic image and emotion demands recognition. Oops. The image of a fist has long been a cultural symbol of forces that existed before my own story. A dream's narrative connected me personally and broadly to the historical moments, inspiring me to explore their importance within myself and the larger cultural context. In its personal psychological context, the dream evoked emotional experience of archetypal destruction. It asked me to consider the distrust and the futility that arose when I did not feel a proper relationship with authority figures. Being alone with my vision triggered the need to leave the room, but that left me disoriented and alienated, a state I experienced when I immigrated to a new culture. And when the Educational Institute became a mental asylum, I realized psychological assessments are culturally subjective. Although the concept of cultural complexes had not yet been developed, I was motivated to explore how my own multicultural background influenced my psychological perspective and behavior. I asked myself, what part of my cultural heritage might be connecting me to the institutional culture of training to become a Jungian analyst in San Francisco? Seeing the power of the fist helped me anticipate a readiness to break through ego defenses that had protected me from the terror of cultural violence and the pain of profound loss. From this perspective, the dream prompted me to reflect on inherited cultural complexes filled with the energy of past conflicts and collective memory, which have shaped my identity and my views on leadership and power. What cultural symbols and attitudes might I have inherited from Colombia, my country of origin? The fist symbolizes the power of its imperial conquest, both as conqueror and more recently for its victims, a symbol of powerful resistance. The cultural pattern of domination and subjugation established in the 1400s by the papal doctrine of the doctrine of discovery supported Spain's claims to territorial rights over Christian communities, allowing conquistador Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada to seize the wealth and the power of the indigenous musicas based on the claims of religious superiority. Conversion and peonage became the cost of survival. Such authority, along with its violent actions, introduced the idea of individual rule over communal governance. Poet José Martí referenced the fist when describing Simón Bolívar, Colombia's founding father, as having a fistful of freedom in one hand and the corpse of tyranny at his feet. This powerful metaphor of opposites has haunted Colombia's social struggles since its independence and unification in 1830, continuing all the way to the peace accord in 2016. This cultural legacy of violence and warfare persists today. It's evident both in its political conflicts and in people's resignation to callous brutality, as well as their strong religious devotion and submissive respect and fear of authority. Legal and clerical authority established a socioeconomic and gendered system of inequality that has left generations of Colombians haunted by ongoing battles for power, which have destroyed and displaced many communities, leaving most in heartless poverty. The mix of cultural attitudes that I absorb from my parents' histories include those from my mother, an immigrant to Bogota, born of Polish and Russian Jewish parents, who left their homes as persecuted refugees. Psychologically, my mother tended to play it safe, fearing how authoritarian forces and cultural biases could impact her life. In contrast, my father's sense of security was rooted in his Colombian birthright. As the firstborn of Spanish and Scottish immigrants, whose families had become part of an established social, political, liberal, and secular elite. When exploring the cultural complexes of a society, it's essential to consider how cultural traumas impacted the individual, with attention to the self-protective mechanisms employed against pain and fragmentation. I first experienced Colombia's violent environment as a child in 1948, when I witnessed the terrifying riots of El Bogotazo. A bullet narrowly missed my mother's head, leaving her paralyzed with fear for many months. Over 2,000 people lost their lives in these riots, which marked the beginning of a decade of conflict between political groups known as La Violencia. At that time, when I was 8 years old, my father was killed in an airplane crash, which became a national crisis since the son of Colombia's president also died in the accident. The grief that destabilized President Laureano Gomez and his government led to a military coup in 1955, prompting my move from Bogota to Long Beach, California. Leaving so suddenly, needing to mourn, and having quickly to adapt to a new culture left me with a heavy sense of responsibility and guilt. Recalling impressions of Long Beach, California, after recently leaving a parochial colonial city of Bogota, I saw a city rising from the ocean, as if it were a vast concrete desert of freeways and shopping malls. My new neighborhood, inhabited by white Protestant working class families, was made up of uniform tract homes with double garages and carefully manicured lawns. While the emptiness I felt in this ahistorical city reflected my personal sorrows, it also exposed the region's racialized and dissociated culture, the erasure of its own violent history of dismissing people and cultures different from their own. Spain's conquest of California was driven by the Franciscan priests who aimed to convert indigenous people to Catholicism, seize their lands, and use their labor to build missions. Many died in actions that justified the destruction of cultures that had thrived for 3,500 years. Mexico sought to redefine its identity after gaining independence from Spain in 1810. In a revolutionary move, the newly formed country called itself a mestizo nation, blending the name and language of a few Spanish and French colonists with the many indigenous tribes and languages. In 1948, after a violent war with the United States, Mexico ceded its northern territory in the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. This resolution intensified the existing racial class hierarchy in the Southwest. Land ownership was redistributed to the incoming Protestant Anglo-Americans, who were drawn westward by the myth of manifest destiny, which justified brutal economic schemes in the name of progress. Seekers and settlers arrived hoping to achieve the California dream, and by the mid-1950s, ideas of modernity and social attitudes rooted in eugenic theories of racial superiority shaped laws and policies that favored privacy and whiteness. And although my skin automatically placed me in that group, I felt no connection with them, no connection to the values around me. This then are just an outline of the cultural complexes I carried with me when I entered the training program. My psychoanalysis, which focused on developmental and relational issues, did not address my cultural complexes. When my dream revealed that my distrust of institutional authority, which I initially thought was just a personal issue, was also linked to the complex dynamics of the institute culture, I began to explore aspects of the cultural attitudes. According to accounts from San Francisco analysts, the cultural and philosophical emphasis of training was on Jung's ideas and on this process called individuation. In the 1920s, a group of wealthy medical doctors analyzed by Jung, who shared social and intellectual interests, gathered to explore Jung's idea and their application to their own clinical work. By 1943, the Medical Society for Analytic Psychology in San Francisco was established, clarifying that training would be demonstrated through an understanding of Jung's theory and clinical use. The first official training group formed in 1962, and it included 8 male psychiatrists and 1 female psychologist. All but one had private practices, and most were in analysis with either of the 2 founders, Joe Henderson or Joe Wheelwright. Philosophically, senior analysts believed that the development of one's consciousness was not an intellectual exercise. Personal work and analysis was considered the most essential aspect of training. Ideas of power and authority were viewed as individual expressions of one's psychological insight, rooted in your own psychology rather than linked to any social cultural factors, roles, or titles. The culture of the group itself seemed to operate outside of conscious awareness, while attitudes related to class, professional identity, gender, analytic lineage, and organizational structure influenced the group's relational dynamics. They were not explicitly addressed. Cultural attitudes toward training at the origin of the Institute, according to analyst members Susie Spradlin and Jean Kirsch, supported fealty to Jung and his methods of teaching, which resulted in imitation and loyalty. This led to a powerful formations in the unconscious of the pressure to conform to particular readings of Jung and theories and practices. Jung's distrust of groups negatively influenced views on group psychology, significantly shaping how the concept of cultural complexes is used in group processes. Little conscious effort was made to recognize the cultural norms influencing the Institute's governance, training programs, and organizational structure. Powerful historical incidences that had traumatized members retreated beneath the surface of awareness, only to resurface, carrying the emotional weight of the underlying cultural complex with when a new threat appeared. but problems were always addressed based on their current concern, as if they lacked emotional history. While envy, competition, love, and hate are natural to group interactions, when left unaddressed, these emotions and their historical roots can create an environment of secrecy, suspicion, and distrust. Therefore, as you can tell, I believe that it's really essential that group processes be experienced and analyzed. The Institute culture typically avoids discussion of power, as I said, and in my dream, a group of 4 analysts and 1 candidate are conducting an evaluation. Although not explicitly stated, candidates are assessed on their ability to demonstrate personal authority, which is believed to reflect their self-awareness. However, the impact of the group's power imbalance on the evaluation process is not addressed. Nonetheless, the presence of term limits in the bylaws suggests an acknowledgement of that when one person holds a role for too long, it causes a problem. But differences tend to be personalized, and therefore difficult conversations are avoided. They're managed privately in one-to-one settings, if managed at all. And additionally, there's a lack of transparency in committee decision making that seems to be conflated with ethical principles of clinical confidentiality. In private meetings, a nominating committee oversees the appointment of analysts for different roles, but the qualification of these analysts are not public, and they're not publicly shared. These factors demonstrate how silence is culturally normative. When noted, the jokingly defensive response might be, oh, after all, we're all predominantly introverts. Cultural attitudes have shifted since my dream. The study of group processes began in the early 2000s and has increased awareness of relational interactions. The importance of communitas, meaning a liminal atmosphere that encourages emotional investment in one's society, was described by member analyst David Treson around the same time, and it has been well received. Nonetheless, thinking psychologically about large group dynamics and their systemic structure, or about how cultural complexes are part of these processes, has yet to be formally incorporated in the curriculum. The challenge lies not only in acknowledging the complexity, but also actively engaging with them to foster a culture that embraces transformation while retaining its core values. In my dream not only reflected my distrust of authority figures, but it also showed that I had unconsciously absorbed the community's struggles. At the time of the dream, several analysts had violated professional codes and crossed ethical boundaries. The figures in my dream hallway serves as a metaphor for the shady activities carried out by individuals whose social and class biases were self-servingly exploited. The third option in my dream was an empty consulting room, a space I needed for reflection and hopefully for wise counsel, which came 14 years later when I discovered the concept of cultural complexes. Jungian analyst Tom Singer and Sam Kimbles argued that the cultural unconscious contains a bipolar tension of traumatizing social political conflicts, which have become disconnected from historical memory. And often when expressed, they manifest psychologically. The cultural complex functions at the group level of the psyche and is unconsciously absorbed by the individual psyche. Cultural myths and normative behavioral patterns develop to contain these dynamics. cultural images called phantoms by Kimbles serve as containers for unbearable, that is, what is too much for consciousness. Phantoms are part of a narrative structure that reflects the culture's inner psychological dimension, allowing suffering to be potentially processed psychologically and symbolically. Building on these ideas, Jungian analysts Elizabeth Bordison and Pilar Amezaga suggested that if we could hold the tension of indeterminate states, which actually exists between and among bipolar tensions of an archetype and symbolic expression, they may produce a creative, liminal manifestation that points to a new form of understanding. Metaphorically, I have continued to use the empty consulting room to redefine my approach as an analytic psychocultural analyst. I have realized that the personal is always connected to the collective, and that unseen social and cultural events spanning generations influenced not only an individual's psychology, but also shaped the norms and the rituals of the group's culture. Based on a dream about my sensitivity to authority, I realized that I needed to examine how I assumed leadership roles at the Institute. In 2014, as the community balanced longstanding traditions with emerging needs to explore culture, power, and group identity, I was asked to help establish an ad hoc committee on diversity and inclusivity, which from now on I'll just call it the D&I committee. For some of us, increased awareness of the psychological dynamics of cultural complexes sparks self-reflection on our resistance that was seen rooted in the fear of change and uncertainty about letting go of some of these ideas that were in the past accepted. As members of this new initiative, we shared a common goal: to learn about each other's diverse cultural backgrounds and how these related to our analytic perspective. Such conversations within a task-oriented committee were rare, but we found them necessarily and highly valuable in fostering genuine interest and empathy. One of the committee's goals was to promote circularity of communication with the broader community. We discussed staying involved in other committees, contributing our perspective to their task, and relaying the community's concerns and wishes back to the committee. We brought awareness of aspects of the Institute culture that could discourage applicants from diverse cultures to apply to our training program. We made a concerted effort to review Jung's writings and identify racial bias. And then we presented this list that we constructed to the community. We also followed it with presentations of our own ethnic experiences of blindness and bias. These intense open discussions created opportunities to clarify our mission and create educational programs where dialogue prevailed. We envisioned that through our efforts, applicants would possibly feel welcomed, not only to study the principles of analytic psychology, but also to recognize and confront the cultural biases and complexes. A year later, when the chair resigned, I reluctantly agreed to take on the role, provided that two of us would serve as co-chair. I was inspired by the idea that together we could embody the group's purpose and mission by giving each other mental space to think creatively while working effectively within the organization. However, co-chairing was not officially recognized as a form of leadership. And according to the Institute bylaws, there should be only one chair. So we were informally accepted. Nevertheless, we persisted. Collaborative leadership would foster awareness, working with social-cultural differences and promote mutual reliance and co-sharing, suggested that the organizational structure would also minimize hierarchy in roles and tasks, which we believe would help committee members, whether analysts or candidates, see each other as equals and value every voice and contribution made, and value the ideas of diversity and inclusivity. Now, I realize 11 years later that not only did being a co-chair allow me to play a central role in guiding the committee's direction, but it also helped me work more intentionally with my cultural complexes. In fact, the mission of D&I was shaped by my cultural experiences. Specifically, the authoritarian governance style in Colombia fostered my resistance to hierarchy and patriarchal authority, enabling me to develop new ways of sharing leadership and responsibility. And as an immigrant, I felt the expectations to conform to a society where history was erased while others were privileged. The pressure of cultural assimilation motivated me to create a multicultural space where all perspectives would be recognized and valued. And to use a concept coined by Andrew Samuels, an analyst in Britain, my cultural complexes have been the source of my social spirituality. Now, I realize I'm not going to read the last few pages because enough's enough. I'm going to show you how I've ended this journey. This bone woman is constructed by a whale bone that I found on the beach in Santa Barbara. And all the little bones that she's holding up are bones that are found on the beach at Point Reyes. And she's all scarred up, by the way. I don't know if you can see it here, but anyway. So that's a reality. That's my inner reality, this bone woman. Okay. There's some questions. I'm sorry that took me so long. Thank you.
Okay, let's go ahead and take some questions. We'll do some Q&A here in the room as well as in the liminal space online. I'll get that going here in a second. But just one quick reminder, we have a lot of interest here, and if we could just be somewhat pithy in our lead into the question, that'd be great. We can give everyone an opportunity to have a question also. Who would like to go first?
Oh, well,
I shut everyone down. Sure, please.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your perspective. And, I think it's a wonderful reminder about the necessity of group work, especially in a Jungian context. I think that's been a theme this weekend already. And I'm curious if you could speak to that a little and just your experience with maybe facilitating group work for the purposes of bringing the hierarchy into more of a horizontal relationship to a greater community, and then what that does.
Well, one of the emphasis in the
Can we get the question repeated for online folks? We couldn't hear all the way.
Hold that and you can do it again. How's that? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, as I was listening, I was just noticing that this theme of the individual nature of the work in Jungian circles has been very emphasized, maybe overemphasized, and also how for Jung that was also kind of a complex of its own, his fear of group work and group dynamics. But there's so much good work that's been done, and you have spoken to that. And I'm just curious about your experience working within organizations in psychoanalytic communities about bringing the process out of the consulting room and in the dyadic relationship, but into the wider community and the cultural implications of that.
Yeah, I think I did come in with a background of before training at the Jung Institute, but was very interested in Jung and also I call the test methodology. And so so I was predisposed in my mind to find the value of it because I thought that it helped me, but it isn't. And it, even though there's a group process training, it seems very relational oriented, very much how people are getting along and that either nod a little bit and, you know, but there's, I don't think there's, for example, I don't think cultural complex has been incorporated in some kind of way to use it for group work. And that feels a shame since it feels to me like that's one of the richest, for me, it saved my life, really, culture. Otherwise, I didn't know what was happening at this place that I had decided to train in. And so it's difficult because the facilitators of the group process need to have these concepts sufficiently in their mind that they would know how to integrate it at times to ask a question or to try to see if something, how some personal thing is getting present in the dynamic, and yet what else? There could be questions about what people carry culturally. But it's not being done yet. And I didn't know this really, but I feel we're quite a conservative group of people. You know, they're individually, people are not all that conservative, but when you get together as a group and you don't talk about your differences. So on the committee, we've done a lot of hearing each other, hearing the emotional states that people carry and all. And yet, nonetheless, it's you can just see how we all shy away from too much. There's a fear of engaging it, and probably because nobody's sure how to manage it. So that's my answer to. I think it's a work in progress. Yes.
Hi, and thank you for the presentation and for the what I perceive as an emotional labor of love. I know that attempting to step in and stepping into spaces, specifically D&I spaces, there's a labor, an emotional labor that falls on the folks who are asked to step into that work. So thank you. And I'm curious, this is on the tail of your answer to the last question. Like, what's your sense of how far, or if, you know, the needle has shifted over the course of your time in these institutions that you've talked about? Yeah, how do you perceive the changes to have been from when you started to where you are now?
Yeah, I think stay for the next one with Natalia. We will hear because Natalia is a candidate, and so she's got a much more recent view of their experience with this notion of cultural complexes. I feel that it is hard if you're just alone. If you are a person of color and you're the only person in a group or something, it's hard to speak up. You know, it's hard, or so it's I don't know how to break it. I'm not trying to discourage, because it's my desire and an awful lot of other analysts that we really do have a much more diverse group of people. But we don't, I think we don't have with consciousness of what we're asking, you know, for people to care. If you're the only person of color in the group, then you're weighted down with an awful lot of emotional weight. And It's just kind of unfair. So, I mean, I think many candidates, and also we have a clinic where there's interns, and there are a good number of people from other cultures, people that are other complexions. And I had a miserable time, and it wasn't because of the color of my skin, but it was because my cultural orientation was really different. And I didn't have language. That's the reason that the cultural complex was so helpful to begin. Like I couldn't think. When I was a candidate. That's the reason I started doing those sculptures. And I never, I'm not an art person. I didn't take anything. I didn't know how to do it, but something came in the mail that said speaking through clay. And I said, that's, that's going to help me. I have, my hands must know something I can't put into words, you know, and I don't know that they help me understand the concept of culture complexes saved my life. At least saved the part of my life that had to do with becoming an analyst. So. What time is this over?
We have about 10 minutes.
Oh.
Yes, I'm Tom Singer, and I think the question about groups and non-hierarchical approaches and how difficult it is to get groups to deal with these kinds of issues reminds me of a phrase that Jung used called opus contra natura, meaning a work against nature. That is, there's huge natural resistance to looking at these things. And I tend to think, I was speaking almost metaphorically this morning about amphibians coming out of the sea and that they needed a kidney to filter their experience because they couldn't maintain an internal sea. And sometimes I think of these group complexes as being like evolutionary processes for group organisms to survive and filter. And the way in which different groups have come into contact with one another over the last 200 or 300 years, in a way, is opus contra natura. That is, we don't seem as a species to be designed to intermingle with differences. It's an incredibly difficult work.
Right, it's the edge of our consciousness. I think we have to push it.
We have to push it really hard
And
because
suffer.
there's tremendous, not only is there tremendous resistance as an individual to develop, but I would say exponentially that increases with groups, that there's just huge resistance. But that's just a comment.
Dr. Franco, thank you for sharing your own personal experience too. That's very meaningful to me, and I think it's precious. We don't do that a lot. And I am also a fellow South American. I grew up in Chile, and my question is about when you discover this concept of the cultural complex, how it changed everything for you. And I'm also an immigrant, and I wonder what was about that as an immigrant from Colombia, you know, and maybe in a white and maybe upper middle class society. How did that idea change the way you saw yourself and you saw the world around you? If you can say a little bit about that, I'd love to hear.
Well, it gave me a context that I wasn't just an individual ego trying to deal with the self. That was the concept, the Jungian concept. And it gave me a sense that, oh, I come from, and that the other thing was we absorb culture. Culture lives in us, and we absorb it. We follow these rules, and we follow these norms and values and all. If you're or you feel pressured by them. If you're not at ease, you feel pressured. But it's all sort of, it lives in the unconscious why these norms are like this or why people have these values. And so I didn't have language. I think cultural complex helped me to begin to think of my own story and give language to my own story. Everything was all personal in the way I've thought about things. And, I did have that psychoanalytic training before I started the Jungian training. And unless I could find language, it just felt like another false self. I had to find my own way of saying how I see it. And I had to first, so that, when I was going through training, why I ended up doing this sculpting, I said to myself, oh, little brains on the tip of my fingers. Oh, they are doing things. And that is what happened. If any of you do artwork, you don't, where did this come from? Why am I doing this? So there is an energy in us, a creative energy that has its own language. So it just helped affirm that I existed in a way that I couldn't yet find language. So the concept helped me start to have language. And really, it wasn't even till when I was writing this paper, some parts of it, that I realized, oh, that's why I'm so responsible and have so much guilt. And oh, that's why, I have this and that. And that's why I distrust authority. It's as if, oh, it made sense to me. And it couldn't just make sense through the transference only. First of all, I didn't distrust my analyst, so I couldn't even touch that.
And we have a question online. Dia, are you available, please?
Yes, I am. We have a question online. Any recommendations for reading on how to integrate cultural complex into narrative research?
I'm sorry, I don't. It's not that it's not out there, but I don't. I'd like to be able to help.
I know we have many doctoral students here in the online room.
You have to do your own work on all of this.
Hi, everyone. I kind of have a realization or something I want to share. My realization is kind of this cultural complex work goes hand in hand with decolonial work. A piece of my personal experience is that when I'm from China, and China was almost colonized, for 100 years, right? And that lives so deep in my psyche. This internalization of the inferiority of my civilization, So when I came to the US, I rejected my culture. So for so long, I think that feed into kind of the individual piece where you're talking about we make the cultural complexes into individual problems. And I think that really went hand in hand with my own rejection of my roots.
Fantastic.
And it's only until I look back at my history and do more decolonial work of my own psyche, am I able to look at the complex again and see that as cultural complexes. And then am I able to go back to my own group, reconnect with other Chinese people or Chinese diaspora, and just find that kinship again. Because I think for the longest time, I just didn't even feel kinship. I wanted to Americanize and be an individual, that's my individuation journey. But I feel now I'm kind of coming back and really enlarge my sense of self or being. So yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's a way we carry some kind of inferiority in ourselves without being, we value something that actually kind of was injurious to our own development.
We do have time for probably one more question here in the room or online? Dia, let us know. And we have one in the room here.
Thank you so much for this. I'm going to try my best to articulate what I'm thinking and feeling, which is also, in development. I remember yesterday, and I can't remember exactly the context, but a speaker said something about how we default to culture when we feel threatened for a sense of belonging. And that is a hindrance to the process of individuation. And at the same time, there is that tension there, right? That is belonging, but it's also a hindrance. And over here, I look at it like, from what you said, how do we kind of hold this tension? How can we achieve individuation while also trying to individuate from the cultural complex, not just as individuals, but also in a group?
In a group.
So I feel like there's a tension here, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have anything about that.
At least in this country that is just full of people that came from elsewhere, that is the reality, I think, of our psyche. We have to hold the tension, and we have our individual way of shaping it and making meaning out of it and talking about it. And we are individuals, but there is a internal cultural biases and values. And if we don't know about them, we just go ahead and act them out. Yeah.
I'm curious about when you became, I forget what the word is, but like the chair of, or, the authority
Yeah.
in the organization. I know that you tried to be collaborative, but what was it like for you to resist authority and then become authority, even if you wanted to
Right.
negotiate another way
Right.
of being?
Well, that was part of the paper I didn't read. So
Well, I need that part.
I will tell you, I will tell you that the idea, we're an ad hoc committee, and now we're going to apply to be a standing committee. And there's been a great deal of fear that we won't be able to have the kind of richness of within ourselves, that we aren't going to be able to have co-chairs because it's not in the bylaws, and it's really hard to change our bylaws. There are a lot of originalists in our midst. And to the degree that it's questionable whether we're going to be accepted as a standing committee, because the members have to decide. And so they're going to, and there's opposition because we've caused ruckuses by some of the things we've done. And so I think it's like one of the lines that I wrote at the end is it's a journey. We keep on going. And that's, there's no final destination about this that I can see. I mean, I have ideals, I wish the world were different, but it's not. And so.
Okay, well, thank you, Lynn, and thank you to our wonderful audience in the room and online. Let's please give another warm round of gratitude and applause to Lynn Franco.